Before the French Revolution of 1789, the Jews were the most visible non-Christian minority in Europe. The rise of the Enlightenment, of freedom of thought, and the beginnings of religious toleration led to a decline in the power of the Church. In 1791, the 40,000 Jews of France were all emancipated, gradually, with many stops and starts. During the 19th century, other European countries followed, so that by 1878, all the Jews of Western and Central Europe were emancipated, but not the Jews of the Tsarist Empire. For the first time, Jews could now enjoy freedom of movement, access to professions, access to modern industry, commerce, literature, art, science, and public life. Jews had been emancipated as individuals, not as a group. When Napoleon Bonaparte, who had taken forward the ideas of the French Revolution, wanted to discover whether Jews could be good citizens, he had convened an assembly of notables, and this was the phrase that his envoy used: to the Jews as individuals, everything; to Israel as a nation, nothing. From now on, Jews are going to be individual citizens of the countries of Europe. Jews were only a small percentage of the population. I don't know if you realise there's only 14 million Jews in the world today. At this period, one of the most extraordinary stories is the unprecedented success story across the disciplines. Unrestricted by the traditions of European society, Jews pioneered in every aspect of modernity. You could almost say that modernity was made for the Jews. The great historian of ideas, Isaiah Berlin, suggested that the story of the Jews and modernity was the arrival of a people almost from another planet, who landed on planet Earth and began a love affair. Back in their own world, they had a long, deep tradition of learning. Consequently, falling in love with the planet, they pushed forward the knowledge in every aspect of life. But what Isaiah Berlin suggests is, how did the world regard these beings from another planet, exotic strangers or enemy aliens? Their success story was extraordinary, particularly those who were working in the German language. It can be argued that the three most world-changing figures of the 19th and early 20th century were Freud, Marx and Einstein, all who came from the Jewish tradition. Jews emancipated into the 19th century began this extraordinary love affair. The 19th century was one of the most traumatic centuries Europe had ever experienced. I want you to consider the extraordinary changes. Imagine you were born in 1800 and you died in 1900. What changes would you see in your life? It's the time of the growth of cities. London was the first city to reach 1 million people. By the end of the century, there were 5 capital cities at that level. The growth of industrialization, the growth of technology, a population explosion, the growth of every aspect of the modern world which the Jews were reveling in. But the question you have to ask yourself, how do most people like change? And in fact, the 19th century was a century of huge trauma. It's a century where you see the growth of nationalism. For example, in the centre of Europe, the Habsburg Empire ruled over 15 different nationalities. Germany, that great centre of Europe, was in fact divided up until 1815 into 360 states. After 1815 and before 1871, it was still 36 city-states. It took the genius of Otto von Bismarck to unify Germany through 3 wars: war with Denmark, war with Austria, and war finally with France. All this instability led to all kinds of problems in European society, and people were looking for answers. Not everyone benefited from the modern world. Imagine the peasantry having to come into the towns to find work. Imagine an aggressive capitalism. Imagine the growth of new socialist movements. Bewildering, bewildering, bewildering. And what happens when nationalism comes to the fore? Tie that up with social Darwinism. Charles Darwin, with his notion of the origin of the species and the survival of the fittest, some pseudo-philosophers took these ideas and actually ascribed them to various groups, and you begin to see the development of race theory. My group, by blood, is best able to rule. Now you combine that with insecure nationalism and you have a very heady cocktail. Who were the non-Christian group that appeared to be doing so well? The reality was that the majority of Jews in Western and Central Europe had become middle class. But what you did have was this small group of pioneers in every aspect of modernity. Were these people really French or German or English? And what about in the Habsburg Empire, where you have Hungarians, Serbians, Croats, Czechs? Where did the Jews fit in? What it led to was the growth of race literature. It led to the growth of anti-Semitism. Jews were not considered to be Frenchmen or Italians or Germans. In fact, they were themselves a separate race, the Jewish race. Race literature abounded in Europe. It abounded most when societies were insecure, and it culminated in the most obscene forgery of all, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which talked about a Jewish plot to take over the world. These were the ingredients that are going to lead, finally, after the collapse of Europe at the end of the First World War and the instability of Europe, to the most genocidal murder in European history. I'm Trudy Gold and you're watching JTV.
To stay up to date with JTV content, click subscribe here if you're on YouTube and hit the alarm bell. And if you're on Facebook, hit the like button, and under following, click see first. If you enjoy watching JTV content and want to help us continue to grow, please consider making a donation to us by clicking here.